They tried to erase us.
A married woman in Qing Guangzhou wrote a love poem for another married woman, named her in the dedication, and published it, 1834. Her name was Wu Tsao. Tsao documented her in 2003. The poem survived 3 waves of erasure: Republican critics, communist anthologies, colonial editors because Cantonese diaspora scholars copied it by hand. Tonight, 4 more like her: a Mohave hwame, the boarding schools tried to bury; a Mughal Sappho, the British refiled as friendship; a 17-year-old who walked out of a Spanish convent in 1607; and the Greek poet your high school sanitized. 5 names that outlived the eraser. Let's go. Sumer, 2450 BCE. The Temple of Inanna in Uruk. 1500 years before Sappho picks up a pen, a singer takes the stage. Voice high, pitch trained, years of it. Their title, Gala. In Akkadian, Kalu. Not a man, not a woman. A third-gender religious role, written into the priesthood, paid by the temple. 3 languages tried to bury that name. Sumerian scribes stopped copying their dialect Imsal around 1750 BCE. Someone recoded it as women's speech, and the manuscripts stopped traveling. Akkadian flattened Gala into lamentation priest. Then, Victorian Assyriologists hit the tablets in the 1880s and just wrote, eunuch. Wrong word, wrong century, wrong file. The receipts survived anyway. Elon Peled, 2016. He cross-referenced temple hymns, ration lists, and the Inanna cult fragment, and found Gala singing in Emsal for nearly 2,000 years. Peer-reviewed. Same year, Near Eastern Archaeology 79, Issue 3. DOI on screen. And this matters, we don't get to draft them. Trans, queer, non-binary are our words, not theirs. What we can say, a third-gender role existed in writing, paid by the state, 1500 years before Greece. Tolerated isn't the same as accepted. Sumer doesn't get a halo. The record doesn't get a delete button. Which brings us to the second name on tonight's list, and the first one who signed her own work, Guangzhou, 1834. A married woman in her 30s picks up a brush. She writes a love poem, a sung-form lyric for another married woman. She names her in the dedication. Then she publishes it. Her name was Wu Tsao. She lived from 1799 to 1862. Qing Dynasty, Cantonese, and she was prolific. 3 waves came for her name. First wave, Republican-era critics in the 1920s and 30s. They were building a modern Chinese woman. Wu Tsao didn't fit the project. They cut her out of the canon by silence. Second wave, communist anthologies, 1950s onward. The Golden Orchid Sisterhood she ran with recoded as anti-marriage labor unions. True, partially, also incomplete. Third wave, colonial editors and missionary translators. Same period, different motive. Refiled her CI poems as platonic verse between friends. Tsao documented her in 2003, University of Chicago Press. The Emerging Lesbian, Chapter 2, The Post, 1949, Cantonese Manuscript Circulation Network. Tsang traced one of Wu Tsao's most cited CI Don Sanger, Cave Immortal Song through 3 centuries of hand-copied editions. Brett Hinch had laid the groundwork in 1990, Passions of the Cut Sleeve, UC Press. The sisterhoods she belonged to were called Zishunu, self-comb, women in Guangzhou's silk factories, who took vows together, lived together, willed property to each other. The Qing state tolerated it because the silk industry needed them. Gregory Flugfelder's framework for this economic indispensability buying social space is tolerated under empire. Cartographies of Desire, UC Press, 1999. Same caveat as Sumer. There is no Chinese word for lesbian that Wu Tsao would have recognized. Mandarin Tonsing Len only shows up in the 1920s, calqued from Japanese, calqued from German. They didn't have our words, they had their own. Zishunu self-comb, Jin Lan Chi Golden Orchid Pact. Their words, hold them with both hands. If you grew up Sapphic, Asian, and never heard her name in school, that wasn't your fault. Her poem survived because Cantonese diaspora scholars copied it by hand. You are the next copyist. 3 more names tonight. The next one walks the Colorado River, and the boarding schools tried to bury her twice. Colorado River, 1880s. Northern Arizona side. A Mohave person born in a body-coded female grows up, dreams the right dream, and steps into a role the tribe already had a word for. They marry women, plural. They hunt. They go to war. They keep the name the dream gave them, Sahaykwisa. The role, hwame. Mohave society recognized 4 genders. Hwame was one of them. Dream called, documented. Older than the United States. 2 machines came for that name. First machine, The United States Government. 1879. Carlisle Indian Industrial School opens. The federal boarding school system runs until the 1970s. Children taken from families. Languages beaten out of them. Mohave is one of the languages they beat. If you can't say hwame, you can't be hwame. That was the point. Second machine academic recoding. Same century, different scalpel. Early anthropologists hit Mohave country and translated hwame as female transvestite or lesbian aberration. Wrong frame, wrong century, wrong file. The receipts survived anyway. Will Roscoe documented Sahaykwisa by name in 1998, changing ones. St. Martin's Press. Roscoe was building on George Devereux. 1937. Peer-reviewed journal. Human Biology, Volume 9, pages 498 to 527. The journal page is on your screen. And listen close. Hwame is their word. Transmasc is our word. We don't get to draft them into 21st century categories. See. Riley Snorton has written about this. Black on Both Sides. Minnesota 2017. So has Susan Stryker. Transgender History. 2nd edition. We hold the kinship. We refuse the conscription. If you grew up transmasc, indigenous, or both and the boarding school silence reached you across 4 generations, Sahaykwisa was kin. The record survived because Mohave elders kept telling Devereux to write it down. Then Roscoe came back 60 years later and read what they said. Next name is half a world east. Awadh Court, around 1820, and the British will spend the next century refiling her as somebody's friend. Lucknow, around 1820. The Court of Awadh. A poet sits cross-legged on a cushion in a kothi, a courtesan's salon, and recites a ghazal in the voice of a woman, addressed to another woman. The form is called rekhti. The voice is female. The desire is, often, between women. The poet, in this case, was Tsao Khan, pen name, Rangin, 1755 to 1835. 3 forces came for rekhti. First force British colonial editors. 1830s onward. Macaulay's Circle. They are about to write Section 377 IPC 1860, and they need the pre-colonial archive to read Platonic. They translate rekhti as friendship verse. Wrong word. Wrong century. Wrong file. Second force Urdu literary reform. 1880s. Indigenous reformers in conversation with British missionaries. Rekhti is purged from the school canon as vulgar. The poets are still read, just not taught. Third force, post-colonial mistranslation. 1950s, and after. English language Urdu anthologies inherit the British footnotes wholesale. The female-female desire becomes metaphor, sometimes spiritual longing. The receipts survived anyway. Carla Petievich documented Rangin and the rekhti tradition in 2007 Oxford University Press, When Men Speak as Women. Ruth Vanita built it out in 2012 Palgrave. The Urdu couplet on your screen is from Rangin's Divan, untranslated for nearly 2 centuries. Now, the crucial distinction. Mughal Awadh court culture tolerated rekhti. Tolerated isn't the same as accepted. Joseph Masad wrote the book on that. Desiring Arabs, Chicago 2007. Tolerated means the court let it exist inside one room, the mehfil. Accepted would have meant had Islamic fixed penalty didn't apply. It did, quietly. Conditionally. Selectively. The British didn't invent queer criminalization in South Asia. They industrialized one strand of it. If you grew up Sapphic, queer, Muslim, South Asian, and your inheritance came pre-edited by the British and the reformers and the diaspora anthologists, Rangin's rekhti was kin. The female voice in the poem wasn't a costume, it was an archive. One more name before we get to Sappho. She walked out of a convent at 17 in the Pope let her stay. Donostia, the Basque Coast, 1607. A 17-year-old novice picks the convent lock, cuts their hair with the sacristy scissors, and walks out the gate in a stolen cassock. They will not see Spain again for 19 years. Catalina de Erauso. Born around 1592, they cross the Atlantic. They enlist in the Spanish army in Peru. They fight for 15 years under the name Alonso Diaz Ramirez de Guzman. They are promoted to lieutenant, decorated, pensioned. 3 machines came for that name after the army. First machine, the Spanish crown, 1626. Catalina confesses voluntarily in Peru. The case travels to Madrid, to Rome. Pope Urban VIII grants permission to keep wearing men's clothing for the rest of their life. The crown grants a soldier's pension. That sounds like acceptance. It isn't. It's a paperwork miracle inside an empire that hanged its own subjects for less. They let Catalina keep the uniform. They refused to let Catalina keep the body. The petition required a physical examination. The miracle is conditional. Second machine, 18th century moralizing editors. They got hold of the memoir and added footnotes calling Catalina unnatural, monstrous, a warning. Third machine, 20th century academic coding. Masculine inclinations. Cross-dressing for survival. Wrong frame, wrong century, wrong file. The receipts survived anyway. Sherry Velasco documented Catalina in 2000 University of Texas Press, The Lieutenant Nun. The memoir on your screen, Vida y Sucesos de la Manja Alferez, is a primary source. Catalina dictated it. They named themselves. Now, two things have to be said in the same breath. 1. Catalina was a Spanish colonial soldier. They killed indigenous people in Peru and Chile. The pension came from that. We hold both pages of the ledger. Kinship doesn't erase the column on the right. 2. Catalina chose disclosure at 34. The choice was made inside an inquisition. Trans, non-binary, butch, are our words. Catalina had one word Alonzo and one document. We hold the kinship. We refuse the conscription. Same rule as Sahaykwisa. Same rule every time. If you grew up queer, Catholic, Iberian, or Latin American, and the church's silence reached you, Catalina was kin. Complicated kin. The kind that makes you read the footnotes. Which brings us to the name your high school did remember. And the version your high school taught you was wrong. Lesbos. Around 600 BCE, the island in the eastern Aegean, a woman writes lyric poetry in the Aeolic dialect of ancient Greek addressed to women, performed for women, transmitted by women. Sappho of Lesbos. The Greeks called her the 10th muse. Plato did. Solon did. The papyrus burned twice. First fire Alexandria. Multiple events, accidental and political, across centuries. Second fire Constantinople, 1204. The Fourth Crusade sacked it. Latin Christians burned the libraries of Greek Christians, for theology and for plunder. What survived Sappho survived as scraps in other people's footnotes. Scholars call them fragments. Then the Victorians got hold of the scraps. 19th century British classicists. They translated the female pronouns into masculine. They recoded lover as friend. Where Sappho wrote that she was burning, plainly. For a woman across the room they translated, I am moved. Like furniture. Wrong word, wrong century, wrong file. The receipts survived anyway. Anne Carson retranslated Sappho in 2002 Nov. She put the gaps back in, the breath back in, the desire back in. Paige Dubois had cleared the ground in 1995. Sappho is burning. University of Chicago. David Halperin's 100 Years of Homosexuality, 1990. Bernadette Bruton, Love Between Women, Chicago 1996. Now. One more honest beat. Sappho's queerness is debated. By whom? When? With what motive? That's the only honest version of that sentence. Halperin and Bruton document the ancient evidence. The Victorian recoders are who handed us the just a friend frame. Hold the asymmetry. If you grew up Sapphic and Sappho was the only ancestor your textbook gave you, that wasn't an accident. The other four tonight were filed wrong on purpose. The version of Sappho you were taught was filed wrong on purpose too. The poet survived. The sanitization didn't take. Both of those are true. 5 names. Now the part of the video the algorithm doesn't want, the erasure arc itself. Who wrote the file? When? And why? 5 names. Now the file. Before the timeline 6 honorable mentions. We didn't have 90 minutes. We had 90 seconds. Each one deserves the room. Nyankh Khnum and Khnum Hotep. Egypt. Saqqara tomb. Around 2400 BCE. 2 men buried, embracing interpretation contested. Greg Reeder published the careful version in World Archaeology in 2000. Hadrian and Antonius. Roman Empire. Not a love story. Antonius was around 13 when the relationship began. Hadrian was the emperor. Age and power asymmetry, plainly. Royston Lambert documented it without sanitization. Beloved in God, 1984. We name it. We do not romanticize it. The Sacred Band of Thebes. 150 male couples. Annihilated at Cheronea, 338 BCE. James Rahm. Scribner. 2021. Wiwa. Zuni Lamana. Met President Grover Cleveland in Washington in 1886. Will Roscoe, the Zuni Man-Woman, New Mexico, 1991. The boarding schools opened the next year. Samoan Fa'afafine, Tongan Fakalaiti. Pacific gender categories the missionaries spent a century trying to translate out of existence. Robert Aldrich documented the apparatus in 2003. Routledge. Now the file. Names of laws, names of men. Dated 1860. Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. Drafted by Thomas Macaulay. One law criminalized queer Asia for 158 years. 1872. Meiji Japan codifies a sodomy law, repealed 8 years later. 1880. Gregory Pflugfelder, Cartographies of Desire, UC Press, 1999. The nuance is part of the file. 1830s to 1900s. Protestant and Catholic missions across Polynesia. Robert Aldrich, 2003. 2. Anne Laura Stoller, Along the Archival Grain, Princeton, 2009, names the archive the missionaries left behind, and the archive they erased to leave it, 1879 to the 1970s. United States Indian boarding schools, Sahayquisa's people, Wiwa's people. Saidiya Hartman's Framework, Wayward Lives, Norton, 2019 for reading what survived in spite, 1969. Stonewall. One Night, in New York. One file in the canon. One file, 2018. Navtej Singh, Johar v. Union of India. The Supreme Court of India reads down Section 377. 158 years of file, closed in one ruling. Most accepted is the wrong question. Most archived, most copied by hand is the answer. The eraser is dated. The eraser is signed. The receipts survived anyway. 1 minute left. 5 names. 4 thank you notes. No subscribe button. Sappho's papyrus burned twice. Once at Alexandria, once at Constantinople. What survived? Survived in scraps. Tonight, 5 scraps had names. Sappho, Tsao, Catalina, Rangin, Sahaykwisa, the ones the eraser missed. To the Sapphic Asian readers, Tsao's poem reached you because Cantonese diaspora scholars copied it by hand. You are the next copyist. To my transmass kin and to indigenous readers carrying the boarding school silence across 4 generations, Sahaykwisa was kin, hwame was their word. We hold it the way they held it. To queer readers of the Persian and Islamic world, Rangin's rekhti was an archive, not a costume. The British called it friendship. The British were wrong. To Iberian and Latin American queer Catholic readers, Catalina was kin. Complicated kin. We read both pages of the ledger. These were also your ancestors. The records that survived for you.